A security guard stopped Keanu Reeves from entering his own event and refused to back down. What happened next not only shocked the crowd, it changed that guard's life forever. But no one expected how far Keanu would go to reward a simple act of integrity. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun had barely begun to rise over Los Angeles when Dexter Callaway was already awake, moving through the small apartment he shared with his daughter and his mother. The kitchen light cast a warm glow as he stood at the counter, carefully slicing apples and packing Zoe's lunchbox. It was a routine he had perfected over the years, quiet, deliberate, and steady. Peanut butter, no crust, Dexter murmured to himself, smiling faintly as he spread the peanut butter carefully across the bread. Across the room, his daughter Zoe, 8 years old and full of quiet energy, was sitting at the table, coloring in a book. Her dark hair was tied back in a braid, and her small backpack sat beside her chair, ready to go. "You sure you'll be okay with Grandma today?" Dexter asked, glancing her way as he zipped the lunch bag shut. Zoe nodded. "We're going to the library after lunch. Grandma promised I could get the new space book." Dexter chuckled. "Sounds like a big day." He ruffled her hair gently, then leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "I'll be home early, kiddo. We'll have pizza night." Clara Callaway, Dexter's mother, stepped into the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. She was a steady presence in their lives, a woman who had raised Dexter on her own and now helped him raise Zoe. "You always say that," she said gently, offering her son a knowing look. "Just be safe." Dexter gave her a small smile. "It's just another shift." But Clara's expression turned serious. "Remember, Dexter, it's not about who's watching. It's about knowing you did the right thing." He paused, hearing the weight behind her words. She'd always taught him that, since he was a boy. Now it was something he tried to pass on to Zoe. "I know, Mom," he said quietly. "I know." By 7:30, Dexter was already suited up in his security uniform, his polished shoes moving briskly across the pavement as he approached the sprawling, glass-paneled entrance of the Global Innovation Summit. The convention center was alive with energy. Luxury cars pulled up to the valet, media crews were setting up along the sidewalk. A cluster of photographers adjusted their lenses, ready to catch shots of CEOs, innovators, and celebrities as they arrived. Dexter's job wasn't complicated, but it was important. He had been contracted as additional security for this event, tasked with guarding Entrance C, one of the key access points for speakers and VIP guests. His post was critical, they had told him during briefing. His instructions were clear. No badge, no entry, no exceptions. He had repeated it silently in his head the entire ride to the venue. His job wasn't about fame or faces. It was about procedure, rules, and trust. If he started bending those, what kind of example would he be for Zoe? As he approached his post, Dexter adjusted the earpiece clipped to his collar and gave a nod to the event supervisor who was making rounds. The man barely returned the gesture, already on his phone. Dexter stood tall beside the entrance gate, watching as staff hurried by, wearing brightly colored event badges clipped to their shirts. Some of them flashed him hurried smiles, while others looked too busy to notice him at all. The early VIPs had begun to trickle in. Executives in sharp suits, engineers with sleek laptops slung over their shoulders, and investors talking quickly into headsets. Each one was checked for proper credentials. Dexter held his clipboard steady, glancing between photo IDs and faces. His movements were efficient, polite, but firm. No badge, no entry. As the morning rolled on, the sun climbed higher, glinting off the glass facade of the convention center. Despite the chaos of activity, Dexter's focus never wavered. He was a man used to standing his ground. It had always been that way, even before he wore a uniform. He thought of Zoe sitting in the library with Clara, flipping through the pages of her space books. The thought steadied him. At around 9 o'clock, Dexter's radio crackled. "Reeves is inbound," came the voice of the event coordinator. "Copy that," Dexter replied, though he wasn't expecting to see Keanu Reeves at his entrance. Most of the speakers were being directed through entrance A or B. Still, he kept his eyes sharp. He didn't care who it was. Everyone followed the same rules. As the crowds thickened, Dexter exhaled slowly, adjusting his gloves. His mother's words echoed again in his head. It's not about who's watching, it's about knowing you did the right thing. He didn't know then how important those words would become. How, in just moments, he would face a decision that would change everything. But for now, he just stood, steady and sure, waiting. By midday, the flow of guests entering the Global Innovation Summit had settled into a rhythm. Dexter Callaway remained steady at his post, his gaze sweeping from one person to the next, checking badges, confirming identities, and occasionally directing lost attendees to the information desk. His focus didn't waver, not once. But then something unusual happened. Out of the corner of his eye, Dexter noticed a man walking toward his checkpoint. He stood out, not because of any flashy clothing or entourage, but because he was so understated. Plain black t-shirt, jeans, well-worn boots. No sunglasses, no security detail, just a simple, quiet approach. Dexter shifted his stance slightly, immediately noticing one critical thing: no badge. As the man drew closer, Dexter extended his hand, palm facing out, a signal to stop. "I'm going to need to see your event credentials, sir." The man stopped without argument. Up close now, Dexter got a better look at him. Medium build, dark hair pulled back in a loose tie, short beard peppered with gray. Familiar? Almost too familiar. "I'm Keanu Reeves," the man said in an even, calm tone. "I'm the keynote speaker for the summit." Dexter's expression didn't change. "That may be, sir," he replied politely, "but I still need to see your badge or identification." There was a pause, not a tense one, but a moment of silent understanding. Keanu tilted his head slightly and let out a quiet breath. His dark eyes met Dexter's, searching, it seemed, not for confrontation, but for respect. He found it. Before either man could speak again, a flurry of movement caught Dexter's attention. Two members of the event staff rushed toward them, badges swinging from their necks, their expressions already panicked. "Mr. Reeves, there you are," one of them exclaimed. "We've been looking for you everywhere." Dexter remained where he was, his arm still positioned between Keanu and the entrance. "He doesn't have an ID," Dexter informed them calmly. The staffer blinked. "He's Keanu Reeves. He doesn't need an ID." "With respect," Dexter said evenly, "my instructions are clear. No badge, no entry." The second staffer, a woman wearing a headset, took a different approach. She tried to appeal to Dexter's practicality. "Sir, he's our main speaker. The event starts in 15 minutes. Dexter didn't budge. "Then we'll need to verify his identity properly." A moment of silence hung in the air. Even the two staffers weren't quite sure how to respond. The crowd, sensing something was happening, began to murmur. Several attendees took out their phones. The situation could have escalated, turned sour, but it didn't. Because Keanu Reeves smiled. "Rules exist for a reason," Keanu said quietly. The words weren't sarcastic, they weren't mocking. They were spoken with sincerity. Dexter blinked, a little surprised but grateful. "I appreciate that, sir." Keanu nodded, stepping back slightly from the threshold of the entrance. "I wasn't trying to make your job harder," he added. "I forgot my badge. That's on me." The event staff exchanged glances. "We can vouch for him," one of them offered, but Dexter shook his head. "I'll need to run the verification protocol," Dexter said simply. He didn't sound irritated. He didn't sound defensive, just clear, respectful, and firm. Keanu gestured toward his team, now arriving with more formal credentials. Dexter took them, scanned them, and made the necessary calls through his radio. It was procedure, and Dexter followed it exactly. When the confirmation finally came through, Dexter handed Keanu his badge with a small nod. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Reeves." Keanu clipped the badge to his shirt without a trace of annoyance. "Thank you for doing your job," he said. "You did it well." At that moment, a nearby photographer, there to capture shots of the event's VIP arrivals, snapped a photo. It wasn't staged, there was no grand pose. It was simply Keanu shaking Dexter's hand, the two men locking eyes. Mutual respect passing between them like an unspoken agreement. The photo made its way online within an hour. Within 2, it was trending. The caption varied depending on the source. Security guard stops Keanu Reeves at his own event, and Keanu thanks him. No badge, no entry, not even for Keanu Reeves. Integrity on duty. Keanu praises guard who followed the rules. By the time Dexter finished his shift and walked through the door of his apartment, Clara and Zoe were waiting. Zoe was holding her tablet, eyes wide, her face beaming. "Dad," she said breathlessly, "you're everywhere." Dexter frowned, unhooking his radio. "What are you talking about?" Clara turned the TV toward him. The news anchor was talking about the moment that had already gone viral. Security guard shows integrity at Global Innovations Summit, stops A-list actor Keanu Reeves until his ID is confirmed. Dexter stared at the screen. Then, Zoe hugged him around the waist. "I told everyone at school," she whispered. "My dad's a hero." Later that evening, Keanu released a short video statement on his official account. Sitting in a quiet room, wearing the same plain black t-shirt, he spoke directly to the camera. "Today, I was reminded why I value integrity so much," he said. Dexter Callaway was just doing his job. He followed the rules, and he did it respectfully, without being swayed by who I am or how important anyone else thought I was. That's the kind of person I trust. That's the kind of person we need more of. The video was shared millions of times in hours, and Dexter's phone didn't stop ringing. Dexter Callaway's shift at the Global Innovation Summit had ended quietly. He had checked out, returned his radio, and given the standard nod to the other guards. Just another day. That's how he saw it. The streets outside the event center were still alive with the buzz of the summit. Attendees in suits and conference lanyards huddled in small groups, sharing conversations over coffee and food truck tacos. The sun was beginning to set over Los Angeles as Dexter weaved through the crowd toward his car. He had already checked his phone twice, expecting a reminder from Clara that Zoe had a dentist appointment next week. But the screen remained empty, silent. Dexter drove home on instinct, his mind preoccupied with the usual, how Zoe was doing in school, whether he could squeeze in extra shifts next week, and whether they'd finally be able to replace the car's sputtering brakes. The job at the summit had paid well for one day, but rent wasn't getting any cheaper. When he walked through the door of their apartment, Clara was standing there waiting for him. She had her arms crossed over her apron, but her face was soft. Zoe sat on the couch with her tablet clutched in her hands like it was treasure. "There he is," Clara said, her voice holding a note of something he couldn't quite place. Dexter kicked off his shoes. "I told you I'd be home early." Zoe bounced up from the couch. "Dad, you're on the news." He blinked. "What?" Clara motioned to the TV. The screen was split between an image of Dexter at the summit entrance and a headline below it that read, "Security guard stops Keanu Reeves at his own event, and the world approves." Dexter froze. The image they were showing was of him shaking Keanu's hand earlier that day, the two of them standing in front of the event's main doors. Keanu was smiling. Dexter looked professional, he supposed, maybe a little tired. Zoe giggled and ran back to the couch, holding up her tablet for him to see. "Look, there's a video too." Dexter took the device carefully from her hands. On the screen was a clip from a social media post, already boasting over 2 million views. In it, Keanu's voice was calm as he said, "Rules exist for a reason." The comment section was blowing up with support. "Integrity," one comment read. "This guy should be running security for the Pentagon," another joked. "I wish we had more people like Dexter Callaway." He shook his head in disbelief. I was just doing my job." Clara smiled, the warmth in her expression unmistakable. "And sometimes that's all it takes." Later that evening, as Dexter helped Zoe with her math homework at the kitchen table, Clara cleared her throat. "You should see this," she said, holding her phone out to him. It was Keanu Reeves. Not in a movie or at a premiere, but sitting in a quiet room, addressing the camera directly in what appeared to be a personal video. "Today, I had the privilege of meeting a man who reminded me why integrity matters," Keanu began. "Dexter Callaway did exactly what I hope anyone in his position would do. He stood by the rules he was given with respect and fairness. That kind of commitment to doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, or when everyone is watching, that's rare, and it's something I believe in." Zoe was leaning over Dexter's shoulder now, beaming. "Dad, that's you." Dexter wasn't sure how to respond. He stared at the screen for a long time before finally exhaling slowly. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Looks like someone noticed." 2 days later, while Dexter was sweeping the small front porch of their apartment building, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. He glanced at it, hesitating, before answering. "Mr. Callaway?" a calm female voice asked. "Yes. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Keanu Reeves. He'd like to invite you to a private meeting at his new Tesla facility in Texas. If you're open to it, we'd like to make the arrangements." Dexter wiped his hand on his pants, his throat dry. "You're serious?" "We are. Mr. Reeves appreciates your time and your principles. He'd like to discuss an opportunity." He glanced back at Clara and Zoe through the window. Clara was helping Zoe practice piano, her fingers gently guiding her granddaughter's hands over the keys. "Texas?" Dexter repeated. "Yes, sir. I'll need to think about it." "Of course. We'll wait for your answer." That night, Dexter told Clara everything. They sat together at the worn kitchen table, a pot of coffee between them, as Zoe slept soundly in her room. "They want me to fly out to Texas," Dexter said. "He's offering something, I don't even know what." Clara took a sip from her mug. "And why are you hesitating?" He sighed. "Because it's a big change? Because it's Texas? Because I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of life." She smiled. "Dexter, when you were a boy, you always followed the rules because you believed it was right. You used to tell me that one day it would lead to something better." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Maybe this is it." Dexter let her words settle before giving a slow nod. "Maybe." The next morning, as Dexter tied his shoes, Zoe sat beside him on the couch, swinging her feet back and forth. She was quiet for a moment, then asked softly, "Do you have to go far away, Daddy?" He paused. "For a little while. Maybe longer if I take the job they're offering." Zoe nodded, as if thinking it through. "But we'd be together, right?" He smiled. "Always." She pulled something from behind her back, a drawing she'd made. It was the two of them standing in front of a big building with the sun shining over them. She'd written in careful block letters at the top, "I'm proud of you, Dad." Dexter's throat tightened. He took the drawing and hugged her close. "I'm proud of you too, Zoe." Within the week, Dexter was on a plane to Texas. He didn't usually fly, and when he did, it was rarely for anything but family emergencies or funerals. But this was different. It felt different. At the Austin Bergstrom Airport, a car was waiting for him. A driver greeted him by name and escorted him to a sleek electric SUV. They drove in silence through the wide streets, out past the edges of the city, until they arrived at a massive facility with clean lines, solar panels, and the familiar Tesla logo. As they passed through security, Dexter noticed how tight the protocols were. He respected that. He was met by Brooke Dalton, Keanu's trusted ally and chief of operations. She shook his hand firmly. "Welcome, Mr. Callaway. We've heard a lot about you." Dexter glanced around. "Good things, I hope." She smiled. "Only the best." They led him into a conference room where Keanu Reeves was waiting. Dressed casually, Keanu stood as Dexter entered, offering him a genuine smile and an outstretched hand. "Mr. Callaway," Keanu greeted. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me." They sat across from each other at a simple table. No lawyers, no entourage, just a conversation between two men who respected each other. Keanu spoke plainly. I need someone I can trust to lead security here. Someone who follows the rules, who isn't afraid to do what's right. You've already proven that." Dexter considered it for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm ready." Dexter Callaway's shift at the Global Innovation Summit had ended quietly. He had checked out, returned his radio, and given the standard nod to the other guards. Just another day. That's how he saw it. The streets outside the event center were still alive with the buzz of the summit. Attendees in suits and conference lanyards huddled in small groups, sharing conversations over coffee and food truck tacos. The sun was beginning to set over Los Angeles as Dexter weaved through the crowd toward his car. He'd already checked his phone twice, expecting a reminder from Clara that Zoe had a dentist appointment next week. But the screen remained empty, silent. Dexter drove home on instinct, his mind preoccupied with the usual: how Zoe was doing in school, whether he could squeeze in extra shifts next week, and whether they'd finally be able to replace the car's sputtering brakes. The job at the summit had paid well for one day, but rent wasn't getting any cheaper. When he walked through the door of their apartment, Clara was standing there waiting for him. She had her arms crossed over her apron, but her face was soft. Zoe sat on the couch with her tablet clutched in her hands like it was treasure. "There he is," Clara said, her voice holding a note of something he couldn't quite place. Dexter kicked off his shoes. "I told you I'd be home early." Zoe bounced up from the couch. "Dad, you're on the news." He blinked. "What?" Clara motioned to the TV. The screen was split between an image of Dexter at the summit entrance and a headline below it that read, "Security guard stops Keanu Reeves at his own event, and the world approves." Dexter froze. The image they were showing was of him shaking Keanu's hand earlier that day, the two of them standing in front of the event's main doors. Keanu was smiling. Dexter looked professional, he supposed, maybe a little tired. Zoe giggled and ran back to the couch, holding up her tablet for him to see. "Look, there's a video too." Dexter took the device carefully from her hands. On the screen was a clip from a social media post, already boasting over 2 million views. In it, Keanu's voice was calm as he said, "Rules exist for a reason." The comments section was blowing up with support. "Integrity," one comment read. "This guy should be running security for the Pentagon," another joked. "I wish we had more people like Dexter Callaway." He shook his head in disbelief. I was just doing my job." Clara smiled, the warmth in her expression unmistakable. "And sometimes that's all it takes." Later that evening, as Dexter helped Zoe with her math homework at the kitchen table, Clara cleared her throat. "You should see this," she said, holding her phone out to him. It was Keanu Reeves. Not in a movie or at a premiere, but sitting in a quiet room, addressing the camera directly in what appeared to be a personal video. "Today, I had the privilege of meeting a man who reminded me why integrity matters," Keanu began. Dexter Callaway did exactly what I hope anyone in his position would do. He stood by the rules he was given with respect and fairness. That kind of commitment to doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, or when everyone is watching, that's rare. And it's something I believe in. Zoe was leaning over Dexter's shoulder now, beaming. "Dad, that's you." Dexter wasn't sure how to respond. He stared at the screen for a long time before finally exhaling slowly. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Looks like someone noticed." 2 days later, while Dexter was sweeping the small front porch of their apartment building, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. He glanced at it, hesitating, before answering. "Mr. Callaway?" a calm female voice asked. "Yes?" "I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Keanu Reeves. He'd like to invite you to a private meeting at his new Arcadia Innovations facility in Texas. If you're open to it, we'd like to make the arrangements." Dexter wiped his hand on his pants, his throat dry. "You're serious?" "We are. Mr. Reeves appreciates your time and your principles. He'd like to discuss an opportunity." He glanced back at Clara and Zoe through the window. Clara was helping Zoe practice piano, her fingers gently guiding her granddaughter's hands over the keys. "Texas?" Dexter repeated. "Yes, sir. I'll need to think about it." "Of course. We'll wait for your answer." That night, Dexter told Clara everything. They sat together at the worn kitchen table, a pot of coffee between them, as Zoe slept soundly in her room. "They want me to fly out to Texas," Dexter said. "He's offering something. I don't even know what." Clara took a sip from her mug. "And why are you hesitating?" He sighed. "Because it's a big change. Because it's Texas. Because I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of life." She smiled. "Dexter, when you were a boy, you always followed the rules because you believed it was right. You used to tell me that one day it would lead to something better." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Maybe this is it." Dexter let her words settle before giving a slow nod. "Maybe." The next morning, as Dexter tied his shoes, Zoe sat beside him on the couch, swinging her feet back and forth. She was quiet for a moment, then asked softly, "Do you have to go far away, Daddy?" He paused. "For a little while. Maybe longer if I take the job they're offering." Zoe nodded, as if thinking it through. "But we'd be together, right?" He smiled. "Always." She pulled something from behind her back, a drawing she'd made. It was the two of them standing in front of a big building with the sun shining over them. She'd written in careful block letters at the top, "I'm proud of you, Dad." Dexter's throat tightened. He took the drawing and hugged her close. "I'm proud of you too, Zoe." Within the week, Dexter was on a plane to Texas. He didn't usually fly, and when he did, it was rarely for anything but family emergencies or funerals. But this was different. It felt different. At the Austin Bergstrom Airport, a car was waiting for him. A driver greeted him by name and escorted him to a sleek electric SUV. They drove in silence through the wide streets, out past the edges of the city, until they arrived at a massive facility with clean lines, solar panels, and the familiar Arcadia Innovations logo. As they passed through security, Dexter noticed how tight the protocols were. He respected that. He was met by Brooke Dalton, Keanu's trusted ally and chief of operations. She shook his hand firmly. "Welcome, Mr. Callaway. We've heard a lot about you." Dexter glanced around. "Good things, I hope." She smiled. "Only the best." They led him into a conference room where Keanu Reeves was waiting. Dressed casually, Keanu stood as Dexter entered, offering him a genuine smile and an outstretched hand. "Mr. Callaway," Keanu greeted. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me." They sat across from each other at a simple table, no lawyers, no entourage, just a conversation between two men who respected each other. Keanu spoke plainly. "I need someone I can trust to lead security here. Someone who follows the rules, who isn't afraid to do what's right. You've already proven that." Dexter considered it for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm ready." The quiet hum of Arcadia Innovations Security Center was a sound Dexter Callaway had grown accustomed to. After weeks of settling into his new role, he'd found his rhythm in managing the sprawling campus. His team respected him now, and protocols were followed with precision. He took pride in the smooth operation, the sense of order he had helped create. But something wasn't right. It began as a subtle discrepancy in the overnight logs, tiny variations in door access records that didn't add up. A maintenance door opening for 3 minutes at 2:17 a.m. A server room badge swipe that wasn't logged in the official report. At first, Dexter chalked it up to human error, someone rushing through routine tasks, forgetting to double-check entries. Still, it bothered him. And Dexter had learned long ago to trust that feeling. Instead of raising alarms immediately, Dexter approached it the way he always had. Quietly, carefully. He reviewed archived camera footage during his off hours. He cross-referenced personnel shift schedules with access logs. Piece by piece, the puzzle started coming together. And that's when he saw him? Vernon Reeves, a senior executive at Arcadia Innovations, well-respected, at least outwardly. Vernon had a reputation for charm and brilliance, a man who moved easily through the upper echelons of leadership. He was on first-name terms with Keanu himself. But here he was, caught on security footage at 2:17 a.m., standing inside the server room. The footage showed Vernon entering alone. Minutes later, he exited, his expression calm, nothing out of place. But when Dexter checked the server logs, there were clear indications of data being copied and transmitted off-site. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. Vernon was stealing confidential information. Dexter didn't sleep that night. Instead, he organized all the evidence, footage, access logs, data trails, and placed them into a secured drive. At sunrise, he requested a private meeting with Keanu. The two men sat in Keanu's office, the walls of glass overlooking the Arcadia Gardens. Keanu listened silently as Dexter presented the findings, his hands folded on the table. When Dexter finished, Keanu sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Vernon's been with Arcadia since the beginning," he said quietly. "I trusted him." Dexter nodded. "I know." Keanu's gaze sharpened. "What do you recommend?" Dexter hesitated. "We could go public now, but I think Vernon's planning something bigger. He's gotten away with this too easily." Keanu was silent for a long time before he spoke again. "Then we handle this the right way, by the book." As Dexter and Keanu worked together on a discreet strategy to confirm Vernon's betrayal, something else surfaced. It started with a strange message on Dexter's private phone, an anonymous text that read, "Your daughter looks happy in Texas." Dexter's blood ran cold. He traced the signal, but whoever had sent the message had used a burner. Over the next few days, more subtle warnings came. An unfamiliar car parked too long near Zoe's school. A maintenance worker, who wasn't on the schedule, spotted near their home. Dexter doubled security around his family, but he knew who was behind it. Vernon. A week later, Vernon cornered Dexter in the parking structure beneath Arcadia's main building. He stepped out of the shadows, his expression carefully neutral. "You're a smart man, Callaway," Vernon said smoothly. "I respect that." Dexter didn't respond. Vernon smiled faintly. "You've got a beautiful daughter. You must be very proud." Dexter's fists clenched at his sides. "You've got a choice," Vernon continued. "Walk away from this investigation, look the other way, and Zoe stays safe." Dexter's voice was low but steady. "And if I don't?" Vernon's smile widened. "Then things get messy." That night, Dexter stood on the porch of their home, watching Zoe play in the yard while Clara sat nearby with a book. The air was thick with summer warmth, but Dexter's mind was cold with clarity. He would not be intimidated. He would not back down. Later, in a private meeting with Keanu, Dexter laid everything out. "Vernon's escalating. He's targeting my family." Keanu's jaw tightened. "Then we end this." The Texas sky was beginning to fade from blue to dusky purple as Dexter Callaway stood at the edge of Arcadia's private security center, his eyes fixed on the live feed monitors. Every camera in place, every man on alert. But he wasn't watching the perimeter of Arcadia Innovations tonight. He was watching his home. Inside, Clara kept Zoe close. They had both been briefed. Stay indoors, follow the safety protocols Dexter had drilled into them. He hated the thought of them being at the center of this, but Keanu was right. Vernon Reeves was cornered, and men like him were most dangerous when they had nowhere left to run. Dexter's jaw tightened as he checked his earpiece. Malik's voice came through, steady and calm. "North exit clear. We've got eyes on the van." The van. Vernon's men were making their move. Dexter had spent the last 48 hours coordinating with Keanu and the Arcadia security team. They kept the operation tight. Only those they trusted implicitly were looped in. It was the only way to stay ahead of Vernon. Keanu stood nearby, silent but present, his expression composed. There was no ego in him, no need to take charge. He was there to support, to trust Dexter's leadership. "You're sure about the timing?" Keanu asked softly. Dexter gave a single nod. "They'll try for the grab when Zoe leaves for her piano lesson." Keanu's gaze shifted to the monitors again. "Then we're ready." At 5:27 p.m., the van rolled slowly down the neighborhood street. On the screen, Dexter saw Zoe and Clara step out of the front door. They were playing their part perfectly. Zoe clutched her music book to her chest, while Clara locked the door behind them. They walked toward the car in the driveway, just as they would on any other evening. The van came to a stop, too close, too slow. "Hold," Dexter ordered into the mic. "Hold position." Two men jumped out of the back of the van, moving fast towards Zoe. Dexter's heart slammed in his chest, but his voice stayed calm. "Now." Out of the shadows, Arcadia's security team swarmed. Malik led the charge, tackling one man before he reached the walkway. Another team member grabbed the second assailant mid-stride, taking him down in seconds. Dexter exhaled hard, but it wasn't over yet. From the passenger side of the van, Vernon Reeves appeared. He wasn't running, he wasn't hiding. He walked toward Zoe like he owned the ground under his feet, his hands raised in mock innocence. "Zoe," Vernon said smoothly, his voice syrup-thick. "Come with me, sweetheart. Your dad said it's time to go." Zoe froze, her eyes wide, confused for a heartbeat. Then Clara pulled her back, shielding her. Dexter was already moving. He crossed the space in seconds, stepping between Vernon and his family. His stance was solid, his face stone. "Step away," Dexter said, his voice low but dangerous. Vernon's smile faded. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Callaway." Dexter didn't flinch. "No. You did that the second you threatened my daughter." Vernon lunged, desperate now, but Dexter was faster. He caught Vernon's arm, twisted him around, and slammed him to the ground with controlled precision. Malik was there a second later, snapping cuffs onto Vernon's wrists. Dexter crouched, leaning close. "You're done." Vernon sneered, but there was fear in his eyes now. The police arrived within minutes. Vernon was handed over along with his men, the charges laid out clearly: espionage, conspiracy, attempted kidnapping. His empire of manipulation unraveled in a single evening. Keanu watched silently as the squad car doors closed on Vernon. Only after the sirens faded did he step toward Dexter. "You protected your family," Keanu said, "and ours." Dexter met his gaze. "That's what we do." Later, in the quiet of their new home, Dexter sat on the couch, exhausted but relieved. Zoe climbed into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You're my hero," she whispered into his ear. Dexter's eyes stung, but he held her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "No," he murmured. "You're mine." Clara smiled from her chair, knitting in hand. She didn't say anything, but Dexter saw the pride in her eyes. The next morning, Keanu invited Dexter back to Arcadia headquarters. There was no fanfare, no formal meeting, just the two men walking the perimeter together as the sun rose over the Texas hills. "You went above and beyond," Keanu said as they paused by the gardens. "I did my job," Dexter replied. Keanu's expression softened. "You did more than that. You reminded me why Arcadia exists." Dexter nodded, understanding. "We do this so people can sleep at night, so kids can play without looking over their shoulders." Keanu smiled faintly. "And because integrity matters." Dexter glanced toward the horizon. "Always." The morning sun rose gently over Austin as Dexter Callaway finished his daily perimeter walk at Arcadia Innovations. It had become a ritual for him, starting each day by checking the grounds himself, not because he didn't trust his team, but because it reminded him of why he was here, why it mattered. Weeks had passed since the night he stopped Vernon Reeves and his men. The security breach was old news in most circles, but not at Arcadia. Here, integrity wasn't something you moved past, it was something you carried forward. And today was no different. Despite Dexter's efforts to stay out of the spotlight, word of his actions had spread beyond Arcadia's walls. Media outlets ran stories about the security guard who protected Keanu Reeves and his company. Interviews were requested. Profiles were written. But Dexter politely declined every one. He wasn't interested in fame, he was interested in doing his job, and protecting his family. Still, it was impossible to ignore the murmurs of admiration when he walked through the Arcadia campus now. Engineers paused their conversations when he passed, offering nods of respect. New hires whispered stories about the guy who stopped Keanu Reeves from entering his own event, and veterans of the company simply treated him as one of their own. That was enough for Dexter. One afternoon, Keanu requested Dexter's presence at a press event. It wasn't unusual for Keanu to speak about Arcadia's mission, but this time, he had made a point of inviting Dexter to join him on stage. Dexter wasn't sure how he felt about it. Standing in front of hundreds of people wasn't exactly his style. Clara joked that he'd rather be scanning ID badges than giving speeches, but Zoe had encouraged him with a smile. "You always tell me to be brave, Daddy. Maybe this is your turn." And so he agreed. The auditorium was packed. Rows of journalists, industry leaders, and employees filled every seat. Arcadia's signature blue and silver banners hung along the walls, bearing the company's motto: integrity, innovation, impact. Keanu took the stage first. As always, he was calm, grounded, his voice measured. Arcadia Innovations has always been about more than just technology, Keanu began. It's about people. It's about trust. He spoke of the company's work, developing sustainable energy solutions, affordable housing, community programs. But then he shifted the tone. And none of it would be possible, Keanu said, without the people who protect this mission. He turned toward Dexter, who stood quietly at the side of the stage. Keanu beckoned him forward. Dexter stepped up, his hands steady despite the nerves prickling in his chest. Keanu extended a hand, which Dexter shook briefly before stepping back. "This man," Keanu said, his voice rich with sincerity, "reminds us that integrity isn't just a word on a wall. It's an action. It's standing firm when no one's watching, or when everyone is." There was a murmur of appreciation through the crowd. "When Dexter stopped me from entering my own event," Keanu continued, "I saw something I rarely see. Uncompromising commitment to doing the right thing, no matter the pressure." Applause rose up around them, but Dexter kept his gaze steady, his expression humble. "I trust him," Keanu said simply, "because he earned it." Dexter didn't need to say anything. He nodded once and stepped back from the microphone, knowing his presence was enough. Back at home, things settled into a peaceful rhythm. Zoe was thriving at her new school. She had joined the robotics team and spent her afternoons working on a solar-powered toy car. Clara found community with other grandparents in the neighborhood, leading a book club and tending to the community garden. And Dexter found purpose. At Arcadia, he wasn't just enforcing rules. He was shaping a culture of accountability and respect. He led training sessions for new recruits, emphasizing personal responsibility. He reviewed protocols with an eye toward constant improvement. And he walked the grounds every day, showing by example that leadership started with presence. One evening, after a long day at work, Dexter received a message from Keanu's assistant. Keanu wanted to meet. They sat together on a quiet balcony overlooking the Arcadia campus, stars blinking faintly above the glow of the facility's lights. "I've been thinking," Keanu began, breaking the silence. "What we've built here at Arcadia, it's working, but we're expanding. We're launching projects in other states, schools, housing, renewable energy hubs." Dexter listened carefully. "I need someone," Keanu continued, "to help lead security initiatives for all of them. Someone I trust." Dexter blinked. "You're offering me a promotion?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I'm offering you a legacy." Dexter was quiet for a moment. "What about Zoe, Clara?" "They'll always come first," Keanu assured him. "That's the point of this. You set the example for every guard, every leader. That family matters. That integrity matters." Dexter considered the weight of it, and then he nodded. "Okay, I'm in." That night, Dexter shared the news with Clara and Zoe. "You deserve this," Clara said simply, pride shining in her eyes. Zoe beamed. Can I help with the training? Dexter chuckled. Maybe one day. As weeks passed, Dexter transitioned into his new role. He traveled more, visiting Arcadia's growing network of sites. He co-led strategy sessions with other security directors, building a cohesive system based on trust and accountability. And every time he returned to Austin, Keanu made time for a quiet catch-up. One afternoon, as they walked through the Arcadia Community Center being built on the east side of town, Keanu spoke again. "You know," Keanu said, "people think I'm the one making this all work." Dexter glanced over. "Aren't you?" Keanu smiled, shaking his head. "I'm just the guy who believed it was possible. It's people like you who make it real." Dexter didn't argue, he just nodded. "We do it together." The new community center opened 6 months later. It offered after-school programs, job training, and family support services. Zoe's robotics team was the first to use the tech lab. Clara volunteered as a reading tutor for the children. And Dexter watched it all quietly, knowing his part was one thread in a much larger tapestry. At the dedication ceremony for the new center, Keanu pulled Dexter aside. The crowd was clapping as a ribbon was cut, children laughing nearby. "You've made this place safer," Keanu said. "You've made it stronger." Dexter shrugged. "I'm just doing my job." "No," Keanu said quietly. "You're living your values, and that's something people notice, even if you don't." They stood together for a long moment, watching Zoe show her solar car to a group of kids. And in that moment, Dexter understood. This wasn't just a job. This was his legacy. The late afternoon sun cast a golden light across the freshly painted walls of the Arcadia Community Center. Laughter and the rhythmic sound of sneakers on pavement echoed from the playground nearby, where children ran free under a wide Texas sky. Dexter Callaway stood near the entrance, watching his daughter Zoe carefully pat the soil around the roots of a young oak tree. Her fingers pressed the earth with care, as if she understood that this tree meant something more than just shade or beauty. It was a symbol. A promise. Carved on a small plaque at its base were the words, "In honor of those who stand for what's right." Dexter's throat tightened as Zoe stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. She turned toward him with a proud smile, and for a moment, the world seemed perfectly still. Inside the newly opened Arcadia Community Center, volunteers bustled from room to room. Classrooms for after-school programs were already filled with kids learning coding and robotics. In the gym, teenagers practiced drills with a former WNBA coach. On the other side of the center, parents waited in line to meet with job counselors or pick up food boxes from the community pantry. This was what Dexter had been working for without even knowing it months ago when he stood at the entrance to the Global Innovation Summit, stopping a man in a black t-shirt who claimed to be Keanu Reeves. Valerie Thornton walked over from the community garden plots, a basket of fresh vegetables in her hands. She had spearheaded the garden project as part of Project Uplift's local outreach. Her daughter Lily ran circles around her, giggling as she waved a small watering can above her head. Dexter smiled. "It's good to see you again, Valerie." Valerie returned his smile with genuine warmth. "I told you, Texas would grow on you." They shared a brief laugh. Despite different beginnings, they had both found purpose in this place, helping to build something bigger than themselves. Project Uplift wasn't just a program anymore. It was a movement. "Keanu says you're the reason we were able to open on time," Valerie said, shifting the basket to her hip. Dexter shook his head. "He's the one who made this possible." Valerie leaned in slightly. "Maybe, but you're the one who made it safe." Keanu Reeves appeared nearby, quietly slipping into step beside Dexter as they both looked over the playground. His signature black boots made almost no sound on the pavement, but his presence was unmistakable. Calm, focused, and grounded. They stood side by side in comfortable silence for a moment before Keanu spoke. "It's something, isn't it?" Dexter nodded. "It's more than I ever imagined." Keanu glanced toward Zoe. "You gave her something priceless. Stability. A future." Dexter followed his gaze, his voice steady. "She gave me the strength to keep going." Keanu exhaled slowly, folding his hands together in front of him. That's why integrity matters. People think it's about rules, about lines not to cross. But it's really about who's standing behind you, who you're protecting. Dexter turned to him. And who's watching when you make the choice? Keanu smiled faintly. Exactly. They both watched Zoe for another quiet moment, the breeze rustling through the young oak tree's leaves. Later, the center gathered for a dedication ceremony under a large tent. Families, volunteers, and employees of Arcadia Innovations filled the seats as Keanu stepped forward to speak. He kept his words simple and true. This community center isn't just a building, it's a promise that we will stand by those who stand by what's right. He gestured to Dexter, who stood off to the side with Clara and Zoe. Some of you know Dexter Callaway. He's a father, a protector, and the kind of man who reminds us why trust and integrity are the foundation of everything we do. Dexter shifted uneasily at the attention but nodded respectfully as the crowd applauded. After the ceremony, Keanu and Dexter took one last walk through the center before closing time. Children's drawings already decorated the walls, bright colors, hopeful messages. On one bulletin board hung a thank you letter from a young girl whose family now lived in one of Arcadia's affordable housing units. This, Keanu said, resting a hand on the wall, is why we build. Dexter ran his fingers across the smooth wood of the entryway. I never thought saying no entry without an ID could lead to something like this. Keanu chuckled softly. It's always the small moments. Integrity doesn't make headlines until it does. Dexter turned toward him. You really believe that one choice can change everything? Keanu nodded. I've lived it. Dexter thought about his own journey, about the day he'd stopped Keanu at the door, about the split second he could have let the rules slide, and what his life might have looked like if he had. I get it now, Dexter said quietly. As evening fell, Dexter stood at the entrance of the center, watching families leave for the night, children laughing as they ran toward waiting cars. Zoe stood nearby, holding his hand as they waved goodbye to Valerie and Lily. Keanu stepped up beside him, both men watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. Integrity is rare, Keanu said, his voice low and thoughtful. That's why it changes everything. Dexter smiled, his heart full. He squeezed Zoe's hand gently and nodded. It really does. The camera pulled back slowly as they stood together at the entrance, the center glowing warmly behind them. A new day was always waiting. The day was drawing to a close at the Arcadia Community Center. Families had come and gone, children's laughter had filled the halls, and the hum of hope lingered in the air. As the sky blushed orange and purple, Keanu Reeves sat quietly on a bench near the newly planted oak tree, watching Dexter Callaway and his daughter Zoe pack up for the evening. For Keanu, these moments of reflection were essential. They were quiet spaces in an often noisy world, reminders of why he did what he did. As Dexter lifted Zoe into his arms, laughing as she hugged him tightly, Keanu smiled to himself. He thought about everything that had unfolded, how a simple decision made on a routine day had changed the lives of so many. It hadn't started with a grand gesture or an elaborate plan. It had started at the entrance of an event. One man, one decision, one act of integrity. And it made all the difference. Keanu stood and walked slowly toward the tree. He rested his hand on the trunk, feeling the rough texture of its bark beneath his fingers. It was still young, still growing, but its roots were deepening, stronger with each passing day. He thought about Dexter's decision at the Global Innovation Summit. When no one else would have blamed him for letting a high-pressure guest through without proper ID, Dexter had followed the rules. He had followed his conscience. That was what true integrity was. It wasn't about who was watching. It wasn't about applause or reward. It was about doing what was right, especially when it was hard, especially when no one else was doing it. Keanu had learned over the years that people often talked about values, but few were willing to live them consistently. Dexter was one of those few, and it had started with a single moment, a single choice. Later, as the night settled over Austin, Keanu found himself speaking to a group of young security recruits at Arcadia Innovations. They were gathered in a modest room, sitting attentively as he spoke. "I want to tell you about Dexter Callaway," Keanu began. "Some of you know his story. Some of you probably think he was lucky. Right place, right time." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But it wasn't luck," Keanu continued. "It was choice. It was principle." He explained how Dexter had stood his ground, how he had said no, even when it would have been easier, safer, to say yes, how that choice had echoed through everything that came after. "Sometimes the smallest decisions," Keanu said, his voice steady, "reveal the strongest people." The recruits nodded, and Keanu knew they understood. Maybe not all of them had lived it yet, but they would, and when they did, he hoped they remembered Dexter's story. Because the world didn't need more people chasing headlines, it needed more people doing the right thing when it counted. Keanu returned to his office later that night, sitting quietly at his desk. He looked out the window toward the community center across the campus. Lights still glowed softly in a few windows, volunteers finishing up late-night shifts. He thought about ripple effects, how a single stone tossed into water sent waves far beyond its original impact, how one act of honesty could build trust that lasted a lifetime, how courage in a single moment could inspire change across generations. Dexter had been an ordinary man with an ordinary job, but his act of integrity had opened doors. It had created trust. It had shaped not just his future, but the futures of his daughter, his mother, and an entire community now benefiting from Arcadia's work. Keanu believed in that power, not the power of celebrity or status, but the power of character, the quiet strength that came from living true to your values, day after day, whether anyone noticed or not. And when people did notice, when they were ready to follow that example, that's when real change began. Before leaving for the night, Keanu wrote a note in his personal journal, a habit he'd kept for years, a way to mark the lessons that mattered. Sometimes the world moves fast. People get distracted by noise, but integrity cuts through it all. And sometimes the smallest decisions reveal the strongest people. He closed the journal gently, locking it away in his desk drawer. His reflection wasn't meant for public speeches or social media posts. It was a reminder to himself, a grounding truth. And as he stood, grabbing his helmet and jacket, he thought again about Dexter's words earlier that day. "You never know how much a small moment can matter," Dexter had said. Keanu smiled softly. He knew exactly how much it mattered. The next morning, as the sun rose over Austin, families returned to the community center. Volunteers opened the doors, children ran inside for morning programs, and another day of quiet, meaningful work began. And the legacy of one man's integrity lived on, because that's what integrity does. It opens doors, it creates trust, it shapes futures. It teaches us that no act of courage is wasted. That, standing by your principles, even when no one else will, creates ripples that reach farther than we'll ever know. And it proves that doing the right thing, no matter how small, is always worth it. If you believe integrity and courage are more important than ever, like this video, share this incredible story and subscribe for more stories that inspire trust and hope.